A sense of purpose, however arbitrary, restores a dull road to its original luster. Past the turnoff to Tbilisi in Georgia, we climbed steadily toward the village, the road paved now, but still glittering with puddles. In a way, those mirrors of water seemed more vivid than the landscape they reflected, as if the fact of a frame gave the sky and trees and hills a crispness and presence the actual world lacked. I pretended I could slip through to that more intense reality if I could only get the angle of incidence between my wheels and the water exactly right, like a space shuttle re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Too steep and you burn up, too shallow and you bounce back into outer space. And somewhere in between, with the speed and tilt just right, you soar into another world.
That was Kate Harris reading from her new book, Lands of Lost Borders, A Journey on the Silk Road. Welcome back to another episode of the Pursuit Zone Adventure Travel Podcast. I'm Paul Schmid, and I interview explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 162 with Kate Harris. I crossed paths with Kate back in 2016 at the Banff Mountain Film and Book Festival, where she was on a panel of women presenting about adventurous travel. And she mentioned at the time that she was working on a book about her cycling adventure on the Silk Road. So I made a mental note of that, and in 2018 I saw that the book was going to be coming out in August of this year, and so I invited her to be a guest on the show. I want to say thanks to VMA 2020 for leaving a review on iTunes. The review said, "Thank you for the podcast. I just want to tell you that I love your podcast. I think it's the best adventure podcast online." Thank you, VMA 2020. Really appreciate it. If you want to get in touch, you can send me an email at paul@thepursuitzone.com or leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. And now, let me introduce my guest. In 2011, Kate Harris and her friend Mel set off from Istanbul to begin a journey on the fabled Silk Road trading route. It was an adventure that lasted 10 months and covered nearly 10,000 kilometers as they cycled in 10 different countries, as well as the forbidden Tibetan Plateau, where they skirted checkpoints and did their best to avoid Chinese authorities, ultimately completing their journey in the city of Leh in the Indian Himalayas. You can read about this self-supported adventure in Kate's new book, Lands of Lost Borders, A Journey on the Silk Road. And check it out online at cyclingsilk.com. Kate Harris, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you. It's such a thrill to finally have it out in the world. It's been a long haul. I thought biking the Silk Road took a long time, but it turns out writing is much, much more grueling.
How long did it take to write it?
Well, we finished the trip in the end of 2011, and I sat down to write with intense focus starting in 2012. And the book is just now coming out in the world. It came out in Canada earlier this year and will be out in the US as this podcast is released. So it's really, it took me, 14 months total on 2 different trips with my friend Mel to bike the Silk Road. And it took 6 years to get a book out in the world about it.
I was aware of cyclingsilk.com for quite a while because right around the time I started this podcast, I was going through online looking for websites and things and people that I could contact to be guests on the show. And I think I sent a request through that, whatever contact page was on that website years ago. So it's good we could finally circle back around and get this recorded.
Oh, no way. Oh, I'm really glad it worked out then. I don't know even where that contact page goes now. I should check that out because we used to have Mel and I shared a Gmail that was like teamcyclingsilk@gmail.com, but I don't even know how to log in to that anymore. I'm sorry, Paul, for the delay.
No problem. There's probably like 500 messages there waiting for you to...
Maybe I don't want to know. I'll just keep going on business as usual. No, I'll check it one of these days.
Another question I wanted to ask you about the book, and we don't have to get into it now. I want to circle back around to it. But were you a part of the Banff writing workshop that they have? Yeah,
that was where I first really dug into writing the book. I mean, I started early 2012, and then it was fall 2012 that I went to Banff for their mountain and wilderness writing program or residency. And that was an absolutely transformative time. It was incredibly helpful from an editorial perspective and very inspiring. And just having like 3 weeks with, the decks cleared, like nothing else on your agenda, but sitting down in a cabin in the woods to write. You can be really productive under those circumstances.
One of the first questions that I'd like to get into is, because Mel, or Melissa, plays a big part in the story, is what do we need to know about Mel?
Oh, well, Mel is, I think she's basically the hero of the book. She's pretty unstoppable as a human being. And we've been friends since we were 10 years old, when I moved to this small town in Ontario. And she was at the elementary school there. And we befriended each other basically playing games and sports at school. And our friendship is it's been one of the big defining forces in my life, for someone to follow you through all your kind of changes and just growing up together, and not always in the same place, but having this friendship that regularly grounded both of us and also set us soaring. Like Mel is always game for an adventure. From the time we were 10 years old on the playground, if I proposed some wacky prank, to proposing to bike the Silk Road, like she says yes and then she follows through. So that's part of her character.
So what strengths does she bring to the team that you maybe don't have?
I'm really good at the big vision side of things, like dreaming up sort of crazy schemes and kind of putting them in motion. And Mel's incredible at grounding these kind of wild schemes in reality. So she's very good at like research and plotting out logistics, planning stuff like visas. That's the stuff I find most challenging, just on a personal level, like what I'm good at. We have very complementary skill sets, I guess. And even on the road, I would crave the like long, empty stretches of road, rough road, usually in remote places. And Mel would look forward to, she would enjoy those as well, but she would also be much more adept at navigating like city streets and heavy traffic. The parts of the trip we each enjoyed individually and then collectively weren't always the same. And all in all, just made a great team. And she's hilarious too. That's one thing you need to know about Mel is she can always put a sort of absurd or funny spin on a situation that makes anything bearable, even if it's really frustrating at the time, like a visa snafu or terrible traffic. She can always make me laugh. My parents used to say that they knew when Mel was on the phone when I was a little kid because I would just be giggling the whole time. And I think that's basically the same today.
Those are good friends to have, the ones that can make you laugh.
Yeah, for sure.
So you guys did 2 cycle tours before this 2011. What was the inspiration to get started in cycle touring and do those tours in the first place? Well,
I was extremely lucky as a high school student to win this undergrad scholarship called the Moorhead Kane Scholarship, and it's to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And the scholarship is exceptional because it not only pays for your entire education, living costs, tuition, supplies, a laptop, but it gives you the opportunity every summer to sort of dream up some wild scheme and then go out and do it. And each summer has a different theme. So you're supposed to kind of focus on career aspirations in one summer and public service in another summer. And for your final summer, and this has changed a little bit since I went through the program, but your final summer was called travel study. And you could basically dream up any kind of journey or experience as long as it had some sort of educational component. And they interpreted educational pretty widely because they approved this trip of mine that I pitched, which was to bike the Silk Road and follow in the footsteps of Marco Polo and basically see how this part of the world had changed or not changed in the many centuries spanning our journeys. And so they apparently thought this had some educational value. And so they gave me a travel grant to be able to do it. And I chose a bicycle just because it seemed a way of getting off the beaten tourist track and to be able to go to places that are otherwise hard to reach, like the Tibetan Plateau or the Taklamakan Desert. And as we were approaching the departure date for this trip, I called Mel up as I was in the planning stages and asked if she wanted to join me biking the Silk Road. And she didn't hesitate for a beat. She was totally in. And I think she actually bought a bike before I did. Like, she just had this level of commitment to making it happen that was characteristic, but also pretty extraordinary. So we were planning to fly to Beijing and then on to Western China and take our bikes out of their boxes and throw on a bunch of weight that we'd never biked before carrying. Like, we really had zero experience going into this trip in terms of bike touring. We were total rookies. And Mel got hit by a boat. She was at our family's cottage. It was like 48 hours before we were supposed to board the flight to Beijing from our separate cities. I was down in North Carolina and she was up in Ontario. And she got hit by a boat at her family's cottage where she was spending like her last couple days at home. And she was okay. Fortunately, the propeller didn't hit her. She'd been swimming out in a lake and the boat just kind of banged her thigh, but she got a muscle contusion and so couldn't go. And the scholarship foundation that I was on, or that I was supported by, didn't want me going alone, and neither did my parents. And I was pretty nervous myself. And so I opted instead to bike across the US. That seemed like a pretty good consolation prize of a summer. And my bike was already packed and ready to go. So I flew to San Francisco instead of Beijing and started biking back to North Carolina instead of down the Silk Road. And Mel actually got better about a month later, to the point where she could join me on the trip. So she met me in Kansas, of all the thrilling places to have a grand adventure. And together we finished biking across the country. And it was a really good thing we started bike touring in a North American context, because there were bike shops in basically every town. There were escape routes all along the road if we needed them. And we basically didn't know how to fix a flat tire when we set off. But we learned so much on that trip. And it meant that when we did finally fly to China the following summer, we kind of postponed our grand expedition. We were pretty ready for biking the remote terrain that you encounter on the Silk Road.
So you were able to get the grant postponed for about a year.
That's right.
Wow, that seems almost kind of lucky that they kind of just reserved it for you.
Yeah, well, I was threatening to just go. I think that's why they were so willing to just let it be postponed, because it was better than me going alone and risking that. Although I'm sure I would have been just fine, but it all worked out. I was really glad to be able to live that out with Mel, with my friend.
I learned a lot from reading your book. Specifically, other than Marco Polo, who I'd heard of, you mentioned some other explorers that I had never heard of them before. And I'll probably get the pronunciation wrong. Alexandra David Neal and Fanny Bullock Workman. What
Yeah.
what can you tell us about these people?
Yeah, other than having extraordinary names, especially Fanny. These were a couple of women explorers that really inspired me as a younger kid who worshipped people like Marco Polo and Magellan, but female role models in the exploratory realm were sort of few and far in between. So when I stumbled across these gals, I was really excited and really inspired. Alexandra David Neal is renowned for being the first European to traverse the Tibetan Plateau and arrive in the forbidden city of Lhasa. And she did this at a time when foreign travel to Tibet was even more restricted than it is now. So this was 1924 when she went. And back then it was Tibetan authorities, not Chinese authorities, that governed what happened in that part of the world. So she disguised herself as a Buddhist pilgrim and walked across the Tibetan Plateau to reach forbidden Lhasa. And then she wrote this book about it called My Journey to Lhasa, which is what I stumbled across when I was younger. So she was very inspiring to me. And then Fanny Bullock Workman was this American kind of amateur naturalist who, with her husband, launched on all kinds of crazy expeditions around the world, but mostly focused on the Karakoram Mountains in the Himalayas of northern India, what is now northern India and now northern Pakistan. And they did some crazy long bike rides, like across Europe and through India. And they were the very first to map what turned out to be the second largest non-polar glacier in the world, the Siachen Glacier, in what is now Kashmir. And so she was also, not just a scientist or adventurer, but a huge proponent for women having the right to vote. So she would climb huge mountains in the Himalaya and Karakoram and unfurl a poster on the top of them that would say "Votes for Women." So she was a fierce suffragette and really remarkable character. So I thought she was pretty incredible as well.
One of the things that you say in the book that caught my attention was that you were born centuries too late for the life you were meant to live. I think you're talking about this life of adventure. But wouldn't maybe one argue that right now is the kind of golden age of adventure? Why did you make a statement like that?
So that comes early on in the book, when I think in the chapter when I'm writing about my childhood and sort of looking around at the world and seeing mostly farm fields and fences and subdivisions in southwestern Ontario, and really feeling like I'd missed the boat on leading an adventurous life on this planet. And I certainly have come around now, and I see it as just as good a time to explore as any, pretty much. Exploration in the sense of planting the first flags and leaving the first footprints might be harder and harder to do, but really, what kind of exploration is that other than to kind of boost your own ego and put your own name on the map, so to speak? And so if fame and fortune isn't your goal, exploring the possibilities are endless. But it really took, a long bike ride on the Silk Road and a lot of growing up before I could see that. So I hope the book can make others aware of that as well. It's dangerous, I think, to write off this world as kind of done and over, and to lament being born in this day and age, because it sort of means you can slacken in your commitment to making this world in this day and age better for everyone, hopefully. As a kid, I also, I aspired to go to Mars because I thought exploration was done on this planet. Like, it was just not even an option anymore. And after biking the Silk Road and writing about it, as well as various other adventures that I've launched on, I've fallen so in love with this world, I never want to leave it. Like, it's worthy of our deepest reverence and admiration, and exploration is right out the back door. So I don't think I was born too late anymore.
Does that mean that you're off of the Mars kick, or do you still want to go there and live there?
Definitely do not want to go there and live there. If someone offered me a, return trip, like, it would be incredibly cool to step out on a different world and look around and really immerse yourself in the alien. But I really, sort of everything I was looking for in a journey to Mars, a sense of like historical precedent, well, that doesn't matter to me so much anymore. And then, a sense of the alien and extreme, well, you can find that in so many places on Earth. And if you look closely enough at just about anything around you, a handful of dirt, it's pretty alien and extreme if you look closely enough. So yeah, I have no desire to permanently emigrate from this world, which was not my perspective as a younger kid.
What is the Silk Road? Or maybe a different question, Kate, is how would you define the Silk Road? What should we know about it?
First of all, it kind of only exists in retrospect, I guess, in a sense. The term Silk Road is a relatively recent invention. I think it was a German historian that came up with the term, and he basically used it to describe the kind of vast trading network between Europe and Asia that existed in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and a little bit before and a little bit after. And this was a network of roads, really, so there's no one road, but a network of roads that carried people, goods, and maybe most crucially, ideas between these two empires, the Far East and the West. And Marco Polo was the Silk Road's probably most famous traveler. He was a Venetian merchant who traveled the Silk Road from Italy to Cathay with his uncles, initially as a 17-year-old. And he ended up staying for decades, almost 2 decades. And he actually worked for Kublai Khan as kind of a emissary to explore the resources of Kublai Khan's empire and report back. So it's got this kind of enchanting history and allure. It was the world's oldest and first superhighway. And I, as a kid, read this children's version of Marco Polo's travels on the Silk Road, and it completely entranced me. These images of camel caravans winding through desert dunes and climbing high mountain passes. It just looked like this incredibly wild and exotic part of the world. And that's when a seed was planted that I wanted to see what Marco Polo saw.
So in 2011, you and Mel go back to get on the Silk Road again, starting in Istanbul, again by bike. What is your favorite part of cycle touring?
I love the fact that when you're on a bike, you're completely exposed to the world around you, for better and for worse, but more often for better. There's a real indie to traveling in the open air on two wheels that are propelled by your own pedal strokes. I love the fact that when you're on a bike, you meet people that you wouldn't otherwise, and they sort of see you differently than they would if you strolled off a tour bus with, 50 other tourists with cameras in hand. I think people recognize that you've put some effort into getting to a place, and I think open their homes and hearts and minds a little bit more to you as a foreigner as a result. And I just love the places you can go by bike. It's the most efficient means of traveling just about anywhere. And I talk in the book about the bicycle as sort of the greatest engineering feat, even barring like the airplane, which led to the rocket. And the bicycle was kind of the pinnacle of our engineering, I think, from an efficiency perspective. And I know you're an engineer, so maybe you can weigh in on that. But yeah, and I love the fact that everyone rides bikes everywhere around the world. You go to any of the countries on the Silk Road and you'll meet locals getting where they need to go on a bicycle. And so it means you're not so glaringly out of place there. People get what you're doing to some extent.
I don't think on this adventure you guys were on a grant. I think you were footing the bill yourself. And from what I remember near the end of the book where you were describing how pretty much in tatters everything that you had was clothing and so on, and that you ate quite a lot of noodles. What kind of budget were you guys working with?
Yeah, we did have a few grants. So we spent almost a year between when I finished grad school and when Mel and I both finished grad school and when we actually set off on the Silk Road. We spent about a year hustling for grant money and sponsors and whatever resources we could come up with, and also working and just saving money to be able to go. But that said, I think we definitely set off with not nearly enough money in the bank to finish the trip. And we just hoped that along the way, that situation would somehow magically change. And we, of course, planned to live extremely cheaply while we were on the road. We basically ate oatmeal and instant noodles, both mixed with peanut butter. That was our core diet for huge stretches of the Silk Road. So as we were traveling, we were, whenever we got to a city and we had to wait for visas, apply and wait for visas in cities, we would upload photos from our adventure. We had a Facebook page. We were really trying to share the journey with folks back home, minus the saddle sores, so they could, experience it as well. And as a result of that, we sort of built up this following that eventually kind of saved the trip for us. We put up, I think we got to Georgia and we were well more than halfway through our money and not even halfway through the trip. And we posted a short little trailer, a video of our travel so far, and included with it a link to a PayPal account if anyone, and just basically requested donations. And there was just an outpouring, like so many people threw in, $25 here, $100 there, $1,000 occasionally out of the blue. And I'm really glad we went through the trouble, because it is a bit of trouble when you're in the process of a trip to try and share it with others. I mean, it's just, you have to carry along heavy cameras and take the time to process what you're taking in, both in words and in photos and video. But it really paid off, and we had this huge outpouring of support that, coupled with the fact that everything got much cheaper once we were into like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and onward. Those countries were far cheaper to travel through than like Turkey. We made it to the end of the trip without too much debt, but we did both have debt. Less than $6,000 each, probably, but that was probably the ballpark of what we were left with. But when you consider we spent almost a year biking the Silk Road, going into a little bit of debt like that just seems, you're only young and free and able to do that kind of journey once or maybe twice in a lifetime if you're lucky. And so I'm so glad we just went for it.
So you mixed peanut butter with the noodles?
Yeah, it's surprisingly good, especially when you get into instant noodles that have like spicy flavors. So if it's, masala flavored instant noodles in India, then it just tastes really good. You're it's sort of like Thai food flavors.
How much peanut butter do you add?
A few spoonfuls, I would say, to like a package of instant noodles. So it's just kind of adds a creaminess to the otherwise bland broth that they float in.
We need to know a little bit about your bike. What can you tell us about it and like kind of the bag setup that you had?
So our bikes, this is where we got really lucky in terms of support for the expedition. We managed to procure sponsorship from 7 Cycles, which is a small custom titanium bike company in Boston, the Boston area. And they sponsored us with 2 fully kitted out hybrid touring bikes with titanium frames and custom fit. I mean, these are just gorgeous, gorgeous machines. And they basically made our trip possible. The beater bikes we took on the first trip were so rusted over and just beat up that I don't think they would have lasted a month on the longer stretch of the Silk Road. So yeah, we had panniers by Ortlieb. That was our main carrying capacity on the bikes. And we just piled stuff up on the rear rack and had huge handlebar bags. And I think we carried backpacks just with water in them and a few snacks as well.
You had bags on both the front and the back?
Yeah, we had 4 panniers on each bike, and then handlebar bags, and then stuff piled on the back.
Did you guys both stay in the same tent?
We did. It's kind of a miracle we're still friends. But what helped is that it was a huge tent. We got called a Hilleberg, I think 3GT or Charon 3GT made by Hilleberg. And it's a 3-person, 4-season double wall tent with huge vestibules. And it's so large that we could actually take the front wheel off our bikes and roll them in. And so we could stash everything inside the tent, all our gear, ourselves, and be very contained wherever we camped. So that was pretty crucial to both weathering 4 seasons of, we kind of went through winter twice on the Silk Road, and summer was pretty insufferable in the deserts of Central Asia, but this tent was a total workhorse and kept us sane because we weren't crammed together too much.
Let's talk about Turkey. I have a quote here I pulled from the book, and you can comment on it and tell us a little bit about Turkey. Most days, we felt like we were biking through the scum on the rim of a giant bathtub.
Yeah, I feel a little bit bad about writing that about the Black Sea. I mean, there were gorgeous stretches, but we just happened to be there in a time of year and along a stretch of it that was pretty grim for a lot of our trip through Turkey. It was pouring rain, often freezing rain, and we were biking. The second half of the Black Sea coast is basically a 2 to 4 lane highway patrolled by transport trucks, and lots of like litter on the side. And the Black Sea itself is an ecosystem that's been suffering for several years now from pollution and various other environmental issues. So being aware of that, like this body of water that was on our left as we were biking east all across Turkey, and then just the conditions we were biking in were pretty grim. But the Turkish people more than made up for it. I mean, the hospitality we received all along that road was astonishing. We were sort of constantly turning down offers to stay in people's homes, and we didn't eat many bags of instant noodles along that stretch because there were just so many meals with families.
What was your favorite food?
Baklava. Easily. Delicious baklava with flaky pastry crusts and honeyed interior and nutty layers. It's like the perfect cycling food.
How long did it take you to get across Turkey?
I think it was about a month. We veered, so we followed the Black Sea. We took a ferry up the Bosphorus from Istanbul and then followed the Black Sea almost to the Georgian border and then turned inland into the Lesser Caucasus Mountains and spent some time in there before going to Georgia. So yeah, it was about a month, maybe a month and a half by the time we got to Georgia.
Most cycle tours that I interview when I asked them about Georgia. They have nothing good to say about it. It seems like it's just a big party when they get there. What was your experience with Georgia?
Oh, well, for one, it was spectacularly beautiful. And for two, the food was amazing. I mean, Georgian cuisine, so rich and so different compared to what we're used to over here in North America. I mean, lots of like ground nuts and tons of garlic, like really rich food. So we loved that part. We didn't get the sense of a party scene, and maybe that had something to do with us being women, or like, yeah, I don't know if a male cyclist would have seen a different side of Georgia, but we found that people are a little more standoffish than certainly in Turkey. And it might just be the extreme contrast there that Turkey is just so incredibly hospitable. And Georgians seemed a little more reserved, which was absolutely fine. And yeah, I would go back to Georgia in a heartbeat. It was one of those countries we didn't get to spend enough time in because of visa constraints and having to push on. But I actually really, really loved what we saw of it.
Yeah, let me read one of the I've got like 3 quotes here I pulled out from the Georgia section because I thought they were so great. And the first one's about food. Let me read this. No cuisine is better suited to the black hole hunger of cyclists than Georgia's, which combines carbohydrates, dairy, and nuts in the most creative, delicious, calorie-dense permutations imaginable. So, yeah. Did you, oh yeah, is that where you had plov?
No, that was further along in places like, yeah, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan.
What did you think of plov?
It was very filling, which is always an asset as a cyclist with that aforementioned black hole hunger. The hunk of meat could vary in quality and quantity. That would be like buried in greasy rice. And I was amazed at the variety, like how much variety there can be in plov when really it's like, yeah, oily rice with the hunk of meat and a few carrots in it. But it would taste really different depending on where we were.
Did you partake of any Georgian wine?
Absolutely. It seemed like every homestead, every apartment in Georgia would have their own little set of grapevines, like on a trellis outside the back or the front door. Everyone made wine there, and we were gifted on multiple occasions like big pop bottles, soda bottles, just full of like inky red wine. And Georgia claims that they were where wine was first invented, so it's a huge part of their history and culture. Yeah, I guess there was some, in terms of, you mentioned that a lot of people said there was a lot of partying in Georgia, and I guess in the sense that wine is sort of omnipresent, that is true.
I want to read kind of 2 quotes here that I pulled out of the Georgia section. I just thought they were just amazing sentences. I love how you wrote these. The first one is, a gold ring hung on her thin finger, loosely orbiting the bone, a hand that had held hunger once and probably expected to grip it again. Man, that's great. How do you just... how long does it take you to like think up and craft a sentence like that?
Think up pretty quickly. Like, I would jot down my sort of impressions of things during the trip in these journals, and really like point form notes that are barely decipherable now. But, I remember that ring. I remember noticing that, and just her gauntness, and maybe I'm reading too much into it to sort of see Georgian history in her appearance and in that ring, but I think it's also a fair thing to do. I mean, Georgia as a country has been through a heck of a lot. Used to be part of the Soviet Union, and a lot of strife, a lot of hardship. And I think that's part of the reason why Georgians are a bit more reserved in terms of their approach to strangers. But yeah, I would basically jot down impressions, things that, little glimmerings in an experience or scene that would catch my eye and attention, and I would write those down. And then later I would, over many years, work up those impressions into sentences that I sweated over so much to make them sing and sing true to what I saw and felt.
Here's another one I want to read. It goes, "Or the face of the whiskery Georgian woman who sat by the wood stove in a small town shop, her warm smile and watery blue eyes seeming to suggest that no road was long enough to learn all I wanted to know and get where I wanted to go." That's great. What do you kind of mean by that?
Well, I have this, I can send you an image of this woman that I was writing about. She has the most interesting face. And at first I couldn't really tell because she was fairly whiskery. I was just like, is this a man or a woman? She had the kindest blue eyes and they were watery, that I'd ever seen. Like there was so much like soul shining through this woman's or a man's. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but I think it was a woman, shining through her whole being and especially her eyes. And she just sat by this wood stove, watching people come and go in this shop that was, maybe it was her kids, maybe it was just in the town she happened to live in. And I just felt like if I could actually talk to her, and this was one of the biggest frustrations of traveling to places where I couldn't actually communicate with most people. If I could just talk to her, I feel like she could tell me the meaning of life. I mean, this woman had clearly lived through a lot and yet still had this sort of beauty and goodness shining out of her. Yeah, and I think maybe looking at Mel and I with the sort of amusement that older people can look at younger people with, who are younger people that are doing something kind of outrageous, but they support it, but also think it's kind of ridiculous that we're doing it. She just had, I don't know how to describe the expression on her face other than what I wrote. This incredible wisdom emanating from her, and that the sense of it, there's a very deep soul there that I felt like she might have the meaning of life, or, it might at least say that there is no one meaning to life. There are many meanings, and say it in a way that I could take that in.
Let's continue on with the journey here. Was Azerbaijan next?
Yes.
I have in my notes here Baku, a very expensive city. It's where you were working on getting your visas for Kazakhstan and started running into red tape. What do you remember about Azerbaijan?
Azerbaijan was tough. That I mostly have, and it's pretty. My memories of Azerbaijan are very much skewed by the month we spent in Baku, where we were stuck waiting for visas to the rest of Central Asia. Basically, the rest of our Silk Road ride hinged on first getting Kazakhstan and then getting the Uzbekistan visa and getting the dates on them to line up, because there are certain visas we could only obtain from the capital city of Uzbekistan, namely the Chinese visa we needed. So Baku is a stressful place. We were very anxious about, the Silk Road as we had planned it falling apart. And it's an extremely expensive city. It's Azerbaijan is one of these countries where the disparity between the rich and the poor is just kind of glaring at you at every turn. When you get into Baku, it's this beautiful, modern, imposing city, like very slick, lots of statues, and everything's expensive. And it's oil money that has really lifted Baku up, whereas the rest of the country is not nearly as well off. So it was a weird place to spend a lot of time.
Next was Kazakhstan, and this is where you did some couch surfing. I think you met this guy named, is it Murat?
Murat, yeah.
Murat. Hey, I got to read this. This is where you had me laughing out loud, Kate. I thought this was so hilarious. I want to read this quote from the book here. I got to maybe shuffle, a little noisy while I shuffle through the pages here. This is talking about trying to get some visas and looking at some of the visas I think you already had, Kyrgyz and Tajik and whatnot. It starts like this. If the visas worked, that is, Murat thought they all looked counterfeit. The Kyrgyz visa was fake-looking stamp on a Kazakh visa. The Tajik visa was childishly filled out with blue pen. The Uzbek visa declared, "This person will not work in Uzbekistan." Murat really cracked up over this last one. Who would go to Uzbekistan for work, he giggled, his huge sides heaving. I wish we had our aliens travel permits from Tibet to show him. purely to provoke that riotous laugh. So I told him about them instead. I only got as far as, and then we turned ourselves into the police, when he roared prematurely, not because he hadn't understood, I suspected, but because surrendering oneself to the authorities in Central Asia was a darkly comic notion. Oh, man, that's great. I
glad you liked it.
I got a great visual out of that one. So tell me about Murat and how he helped you with the visa situation.
Yeah, Murat was a couch surfing host. We relied so heavily on couch surfing in these big expensive cities like Baku, and this was in Almaty with Murat in Kazakhstan. And he was just this lovely guide. His family ran a travel agency, so he was very adept at maneuvering through the bureaucracy of tourism in Central Asia. So he really, really helped us out. It was just pure fluke that we landed with a guy whose family ran a travel agency, but it ended up being the best possible luck. Yeah, and he was just incredibly warm, hilarious human being that, like so many people along the Silk Road, just like opened his doors to us and helped us and saw us on our way.
So you got 60-day Tajik visas. Isn't Tajikistan the place where most people only get like a 7-day transit visa?
You might be thinking of Turkmenistan.
Okay,
Turkmenistan probably. Is that I've heard about we didn't go through there. I'd be fascinated to see that part of the world. But Tajikistan, I think 30 days is pretty standard for Americans, North Americans, Canadians traveling there. And somehow we got this 60-day visa, which was like the longest visa we had for any country. So we finally weren't rushed and could slow down and stop wherever we wanted, detour wherever we wanted without worrying about not making the next country in time.
So getting back to the darkly comic notion of handing yourselves over to the authorities in Central Asia, did you, during your trip there, have any run-ins with law enforcement, and how did that go?
We didn't at all in Central Asia, to our shock. We had been warned many things by many people, and in Uzbekistan in particular, there was a system where you were supposed to have receipts from every single place you stayed during your tourist visit there. And I think we had 25-day visas for Uzbekistan, and we had to enter on a certain day and leave on a certain day, which wasn't much time to bike across the whole country from west to east. And we were going to be camping the whole way, so we weren't going to be able to procure these hotel receipts, and apparently you needed them to leave the country. Like, Central Asia is pretty in love with bureaucracy. That's sort of a synonym for Central Asia. And so we went to great lengths to procure these receipts, which we did by bribing hotels to like backdate slips that said we had stayed there. And we did this for our whole traverse of Uzbekistan. And then we got to the exit customs and border post, and they didn't even ask for them. They were super friendly. They were fascinated by us and where we'd gone and what we'd done. And they just kind of waved us out. So we got off really easy, or we went to extreme lengths that were not necessary. It's hard to say.
What did you think of Tajikistan?
Tajikistan was one of my favorite stretches of the trip. And of all the places along the Silk Road, it's the one I've gone back to since returning from this big bike ride. I went back there a couple of years ago with some friends to do a ski traverse of basically the chunk of it we biked, the Pamir Plateau, Pamir Mountains, because I wanted to see it in winter, and I just wanted to get back there. It's an extraordinarily beautiful country, one of the most mountainous in the world, and it doesn't have much tourism. I should put a bracket around that and say yet, because I really do think it's going to blow up in terms of tourism. It's sort of how I imagine Nepal was maybe 20 or 30 years ago, like spectacular trekking possibilities, incredibly warm and friendly people and remote villages, amazing wildlife, and it's some of the highest concentrations of snow leopards compared to any other Himalayan countries. It's got some of the greatest numbers per capita of snow leopard and Marco Polo sheep, ibex, all these incredible mountain animals that you can see fairly easily there. So yeah, Tajikistan, it's also one of the poorest countries of the former Soviet Union, and it was sort of dealt the short stick when borders got thrown down after the fall of the USSR. And there are traditionally Tajik cities that are now in Uzbekistan, like Samarkand and Bukhara, where a lot of the tourists go. So it's a struggling country for sure. There are tensions just under the surface. It had a civil war in the early 1990s, I guess. I think it was 1991. Civil war broke out, and it's right up next to Afghanistan. So there's apparently a lot of opium smuggling that happens through Tajikistan. But all that said, go there. Like it's an amazing place, and I feel like it's just on the verge of being discovered.
Let's continue on with the journey here and kind of, because I want to get us to the Tibetan Plateau. Do you first like get into China and then you somehow come across like some sort of a border crossing that leads in the Tibetan Plateau into what, the former Tibet, or is it still called Tibet? Or explain how that works and how you guys kind of had to lay low and disguise yourselves to try to get through without the Chinese kicking you out.
Sure. Yeah. So we went into China first, the far west of China. The first major stop there was a city called Kashgar, which is a famous Silk Road outpost and a place Mel and I had actually been to 5 years previous on our first bike trip. And it had transformed dramatically in that time. And a lot of the old city had been torn down. It used to have these amazing clay and brick walls that had been there for probably 1,000 years. And the Chinese government tore a lot of that down, arguing that it wasn't earthquake friendly. Never mind that it had survived so many hundreds of years just fine. So that was our first signal that things had really clamped down in terms of Chinese control over traditionally minority regions, like ethnic minorities in China. In Xinjiang, which is the province or quote autonomous region that's not at all autonomous in the far west that's above Tibet, and then the Tibetan Plateau and what China calls the Tibetan Autonomous Region now is below Xinjiang. So we came in through Kashgar, and then we planned to take the route we had taken 5 years previously into Tibet, which is the Western Road, but it was closed for construction, so paving it over, which is hard to imagine the stretch of country that we biked being paved over because it was just so gnarly, so out there and remote and high and cold, even in August. But yeah, apparently there's a paved highway now running down that side of Tibet. But this forced us to go in through the only other road leading to Tibet from the north, which is via Ching Hai Province. And that was far enough away from Kashgar and Xinjiang that we wouldn't have enough time to bike there and then bike across Tibet on our visas. So we took a train to Golmud, this city in Qinghai, and then biked south across the Tibetan Plateau from there. And that's when we really had to be on guard. We didn't have permits and guides to travel through Tibet, which is what you need to travel there legally. And the way we got around this was, first of all, traveling on bicycles, and second of all, traveling a bunch at night to avoid checkpoints, and by day, trying to make yourselves look as much as possible like Chinese cyclists. So we had China's national flag stuck on our bikes. It was flapping from the front and back of our bikes. And we wore a face mask because all the Chinese cyclists we saw, and we saw a lot, it's a very popular route for young Chinese people, sort of maybe just graduated from university. It seems the thing to do is to bike from Golmud to Lhasa. And they have nice bikes and they've got panniers just like us. And from a distance, we would look exactly the same, and especially because they wore these face masks, whether against dust or maybe against skin darkening. I know most of the skin creams you buy in China are like whitening creams, which is very bizarre, but I think people are very preoccupied about the shade of their skin there. And so we were able to just sneak our way across, and we had one really scary military checkpoint that we snuck around. But other than that, no one bothered us and no one clued into the fact that we were foreigners. And we didn't stop anywhere. We basically couldn't stop in any towns. We couldn't stop to buy food or resupply instant noodles on the way because we were so paranoid about getting caught. So we packed what we needed for a month and just biked.
And what kind of weather was it?
Well, it was August, so it was as warm as it probably gets at 14,000 feet. But we were dressed. This is another thing that facilitated the disguise of trying to look like Chinese cyclists. We were covered from head to toe. We'd be wearing long johns and long sleeve shirts because it was always windy and there was always an edge of cold to that wind, especially when we climbed passes that were like 17,000 feet along the way. But in the lower valleys, it was pretty lush in places, lots of like grasslands and people growing barley and different crops. So it was one of those cold by night, but warm enough by day climates that wasn't too uncomfortable.
Do you cycle from the Tibetan Plateau to India?
Yeah, so we cycled from Lhasa. We went south into Nepal, and we basically popped out in Kathmandu, and then we biked west all the way across Nepal and into India. So it was a detour through Nepal, but otherwise India was sort of next up. And at one point on our trip, I think we were in Tajikistan, right near the border with China and the border with Afghanistan. And it's a very narrow part of Afghanistan. So the border with Pakistan isn't far away, and the border with India isn't far away from that. And so we were maybe like 300 kilometers from our final chosen destination of the Saichin Glacier, this glacier that Fanny, Bullock, Workman explored back in the day. But it would take us 3 months and thousands of kilometers to get to that point because of borders.
Yeah, that's a big part of your kind of the theme in your book too, is borders. What do you think, I guess, in terms of borders in today's world? Do you think that they play a place?
I certainly think borders have a place in the sense of organizing society, organizing life to an extent, as kind of zones of bureaucracy, I guess, for just keeping things running. But my sort of grudge against borders is how they just reinforce the massive inequalities we have in our world. And, you know, the fact that you and I were born by fluke in relatively affluent countries, that just sets us ahead for the rest of our lives. And the fact that someone's born in a poor village in Tajikistan probably means they'll never leave their country, just by virtue of the passport they happen to carry. And that feels really unjust, and it feels like so many borders just reinforce the different forms of violence that we see in the world, both against people, against wildlife. They're not working for social justice, that's for sure. And I think it's important to see them as the arbitrary lines on a map that they are. Like they're made up things, and it doesn't mean they don't have very real consequences, but it doesn't mean they're worth celebrating either.
Kate, what was your biggest takeaway from the adventure?
Well, as someone who very legitimately intended to go to space as a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to go to Mars. I thought this planet was old news. This bike ride on the Silk Road really hit home for me how dazzling and diverse and strange and wondrous and beautiful this planet that we all call home really is, and how fragile it is and how interconnected we all are. So I guess I have this real sense of being an earthling, and that sounds kind of bizarre or sci-fi, but my allegiances are here to this world, to everyone on it, human and otherwise, from wildlife to people. We're all earthlings, and we're all in this together, and this is the one home we have in the vastness of the universe. And if that's not an argument for taking better care of each other and our planet, then I don't know what is. So I guess I return home with that deep ethic, really, of care and concern and connectedness with this planet.
What do you want people to take away from reading your book?
I hope it makes them realize that the world beyond our borders, beyond North America, beyond whatever country they happen to live in, is mad and wondrous and full of incredibly kind people and incredibly beautiful vistas, as much as it is full of sort of sadness and heartbreak, which is really the only story we get from reading the news. So I hope it gives a more balanced view of how many people in many parts of the world are living out their lives, and that many of them are far more similar to you than you might imagine, and they're aims and ambitions and dreams for themselves. I hope it makes people feel more connected to the big picture.
Are you related to William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame?
Apparently. This is a bit of a family, I think the word is apocryphal. My grandma told me this when I was a kid. And my grandma has since passed away. It's my dad's mother. And my mom is really into like Ancestry.com now. And so far, this link has not shown up. So I don't really know what to think. But even if it was a lie, it served a really important role in my life. You know, really thinking of that connection was inspiring at a crucial time, in a crucial age. But Ancestry.com has yet to verify it.
And you got 9 cavities after this 2011 adventure?
Oh my gosh, yes. Too much baklava, too much sugar generally. Mel ate the exact same diet as me and she had no cavities, so I really think my teeth are just more vulnerable. Some of us are more vulnerable to cavities than others. And yeah, I didn't have much luck on that front. That was brutal, coming home from the trip and being in debt and then having to somehow pay to have my cavities filled. Not ideal.
All right, tell me a bit about this off-grid cabin that you live in.
Yeah, I'm talking to you from it right now, so you can tell that it has Wi-Fi, even though it doesn't have running water or a septic system. But Wi-Fi is all you need, really, to make a go of it these days. It's my favorite place in all the world, this tiny community called Atlin on the edge of the Juneau Icefield, which is a spectacular expanse of glaciers between British Columbia, Yukon, and Alaska. And I live in, there's 300 people that live in this town, and I'm about 15 kilometers, 10 miles or so out of town on a dead-end road that turns off of another dead-end road. And it's my favorite place. It's a place where you can just sort of remember that you're not the biggest and most important thing in the universe because, that grizzly bear wandering past your cabin has way more right to be here than you. And I love writing from a place that offers that reminder of our ultimately small yet significant place in the scheme of things on this wild planet.
This is your writing cabin, or this is where you live full time?
This is where I live full time, although full time is, I travel a lot, and my partner just recently got a job in Ontario. So I travel to Ontario a lot, which is also where my family is. So it's my permanent address. It's my home, but I am on the move. I probably spend about 8 out of 12 months here a year.
Let's get back real quickly to the Banff writing program. What is it? What is it about the program that helps you? I know it's kind of a weird question. I'm trying to figure out how to word this question, but like you go there, you just have all these notes and maybe you have a rough draft and maybe it's not as good as you want. You want to make it better. What is it about the program that really helps you kind of get to the point and to craft out the type of sentences and paragraphs and book that you want?
I think it's a few factors. For one, just getting into the program felt like a huge gift and accomplishment. I'd never studied writing before. I'd written sort of travel articles here and there for quite small publications, but even I didn't really know. I announced that I was going to write a book about this bike ride, but secretly I was like, how am I ever going to do this? Like, I just had no idea how to actually go about doing it. And the fact that Banff, the editors at Banff, first of all, believed in the rough draft of like a chapter that I hope to eventually build into a book, that was a huge affirmation that like I wasn't totally crazy to be trying to write this thing because someone out there was willing. The Banff program, most people who go, you get a scholarship to go. So someone out there believed in this terrible draft enough to give me a scholarship that I could come to Banff and make it better. And then once you're at Banff, you really, so often when you write at home, there in the back of your head, there are all these sort of to-do lists. Oh, you should clean the dishes from the morning, or oh, you should really get to work on changing out the winter tires in your car for summer tires. And there's just a lot that you should, a million emails you should be answering. And when you go to a residency like Banff, you're justified in putting all of that aside because it would be a total waste of the opportunity if you didn't put absolutely everything into your writing for those 3 weeks that you are lucky enough to be there for. So I think just that sense of like clearing the decks, like nothing matters but the book you are trying to write while you're there. And then above and beyond that is the community of people that you're there with. They're all working on their own projects, often in vastly different genres, on vastly different subjects. But you get together every few days and read each other's work and really spur each other on to dig deeper and do better. And then beyond that, even you get assigned one of two, usually two, I think they've got three now, editors that you work with one-on-one. And so you meet with them every few days and they read what you've been working on and give suggestions. And the woman I was working with, Marty Jackson, kicked my butt in all the best ways. I'd never taken writing classes before, so I was really feeling my way forward in the dark. And she told me some things then that really helped me envision the book. Instead of being lost in how to, capture Turkey in a chapter, think of 6 moments in Turkey that can tell the emotional arc of what you lived through in Turkey on the page. So strategies like that for how to break down the insane detail that you've gathered in journals and notes into sort of a manageable strategy for how to write up an entire country in just a chapter. She encouraged me to think in terms of scenes and think about dialogue as a really powerful tool, but not one you want to use too often. She just had some really great tips at a really formative stage in the book writing. And then I left Banff just like wanting to prove I could pull this off. And I brought this sort of same intense focus home with me. For 5 or 6 years, I made no money, just enough to live. And all my energy, all the best of my energy went into the book, just trying to bring it to the next level. I mean, writing is mostly rewriting. And I think the best writers out there love the rewriting process. Like you hear all these stories of someone sitting down and the story just flowing out of their fingertips and then they were done. And I think that's like you get struck by lightning more often than that happens. Writing is really just hard work and reading really good literature and then going back to your own work and seeing how far it is from the quality of that material and then trying to make it better.
Yeah, well, congratulations again. I thought you did a great job. It's a great book, and I'd highly encourage people to go check it out because there's a lot of stuff, there's a ton of stuff in there we didn't even get into. So yeah, definitely go check out the book, Lands of Lost Borders, A Journey on the Silk Road. Kate Harris, what is on the horizon for you?
Well, I'm really enjoying setting up a cabin and our homestead here to be as sort of self-sufficient and self-reliant an abode and place to live as possible. So, working on a greenhouse and building a guest cabin, just learning how to live more lightly on the land is like a daily adventure and challenge. It's sort of like being in expedition mode all the time, but you actually get to unpack your bags in this cute little cabin. So I'm loving that, and I really want to make myself a deep citizen of this place. I want to know all the names of the flowers and all the plants and shrubs and animals, really, really get to know this place deeply. And so essentially I'm exploring in place with the idea of greater intimacy with the place I call home. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm learning how to fly. I'm working on a private pilot's license at the moment and hopefully more flying beyond that. So that's been a huge thrill.
Kate, how can people contact you, and also how do they get a copy of the book?
Yeah, people can check out my website and my email's on there. I'm always happy to hear from folks. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and you can find the links to all those on my website, which is www.kateharris.ca. And as far as getting the book, it should be in bookstores across the U.S. as of August 21st. And if it's not at your local independent bookstore, then just ask them for it and they can order it in. And it will definitely be in places like Barnes & Noble and all the big retail stores, and also on Amazon.
Okay, Kate Harris, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing the story. And again, encourage everybody to check out the book, Lands of Lost Borders, A Journey on the Silk Road. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much, Paul. Wonderful to chat with you.
Thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, here are a few simple ways. 1, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you listen to the podcast. 2, You can like and follow the show on Facebook and Twitter at The Pursuit Zone. 3. You can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or iTunes or Spotify. This episode was recorded on June 29th, 2018. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.